family having a barbecue in Oakland, and she calls the police saying, "You can't have this barbecue." That's the same mentality that comes from the Virginia slave codes. It's the idea that you have two different classes of people, one white, that regardless of your social standing, you have privileges, and one black that says you have no access to any kind of freedom or liberty. Now, you were asking about gun control. In those same Virginia slave codes, there is gun control, where black people are prevented from having any contact with any kind of weapon, right? And it makes sense when you start thinking about it from what white people were thinking at the time. There's more slaves than there are white people. Why would we ever want the people beneath us to have access to weapons?
Oh, no.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
And so this is a thing that we continually see. Like when the Second Amendment was argued, a lot of wealthy people wanted to ensure that there was a Second Amendment because if we're creating a whole new country, which is the United States, the Constitution essentially creates the concept of the military, of a national military, that from the 13 states, representatives from the 13 states join this military, and they don't have an allegiance to their state. They have an allegiance to the country. But the American military cannot invade the United States. Like, that's not a thing it can do. It can invade Mexico, it can invade Canada, it can invade Cuba, which it does, right? But it cannot invade like Georgia or South Carolina or worse, Virginia, right? And Virginia by 1787 had the largest concentration of slaves. The largest slave owner, George Washington.
Right.
So how do we protect white people from slave revolts? Because up until that point, there were so many slave revolts that took place throughout the colonies that white people were scared of slaves. So how do we protect ourselves if the military isn't allowed to do that? Well, if we have a militia, then we can do that. If you read the Second Amendment, it says a well-regulated militia, meaning white people having guns is access to a militia, right? If you can become part of a militia, then you can defend the state from within, right? And so the Second Amendment, as a rule, was meant to protect white people from slaves, right? Fast forward to 1960s, and you have the Mulford Act here in California, which is the first law in the United States to ban open carrying of guns, right? Why does that happen? Because the Black Panthers in Oakland are following the police. They're cop watching. They're making sure that basic stops don't end with, a beatdown. And what's the only way that you can actually show defense against full authority? It's with violence. Violence is the only thing that authority ever reacts to. So how do we prevent black people from carrying guns in the United States? Ronald Reagan, the fucking hero of Republican gun advocates, passes a law, signs into a law saying there's no reason why any reasonable person should carry a gun. That's Ronald Reagan saying this, and he passes the first gun control law that becomes the foundational idea of gun control in the United States here in California in the 1960s. Why? Because black people are becoming a existential threat to white people.
I'm like, oh my God, I miss my classes. Community college was much more rich. No, I'm like processing. That is a lot. And so, I kind of want to backtrack real quick to what you were saying in regards to, because I remember you mentioning violence specifically. Mm-hmm. And I remember one time you said in class, you said violence is, I don't want to butcher it, I always do, but basically that the only language that the US or America knows is violence. So I don't know if you want to kind of continue with that, with violence, and how a lot of people, especially when, Black Lives Matter movement was going on, and there was people protesting and rioting, and a lot of people were like defending, but what about the mom and pop shops? What about the businesses? Some people were even saying, like in Oxnard, they were like, what about y'all are destroying the grass? Like literally people saying that. And so if you can kind of go from there in regards to violence, and what are your thoughts? Do you think, I don't even think we're ever going to have open carry. I don't think California will ever be an open carry state. At least not until I'm like dead. But
Um, part of it, part of what you're saying in terms of the open carry has a lot to do with the fact that um, capitalism has essentially engulfed not just the conservative spectrum, but also the liberal spectrum of American politics, right? It's why a lot of people dismissively look at the Democrats and Republicans as two sides of the same coin, right? Now, they're not exactly the same, to be fair, right? One has one perspective about black people, about immigrants. The other one has a less violent perspective of that, right? That's not to say that they're both, that one is good, one is bad, because, well, depending on your perspective of capitalism and the American system, one is definitely bad, the other one is less bad, right? And so, but capitalism requires submission, right? It requires people to consciously know that there's no way out of it, right? Like, you go to work, you shut the fuck up, and you do as you're told, right? Sorry, didn't mean to curse, but that's essentially the way that capitalism expects us to function, right? So, as you look at California, its more liberal bent has to do with social issues, not economic issues, right? You look at LA specifically, we're supposed to host the Olympics in 6 years. First of all, no one asked us to do that, right? There was never any election. There was we had no concept of democracy in supposedly the greatest democracy in the world, here, the United States. No one voted on this except the 9 people that work in the city council. Coincidentally, all of them fueled by real estate money here in LA, right? So we have the Olympics coming, and that brings more security, and we had the Olympics in 1932. That meant increased militarization for the LAPD, which you can draw a straight line from that to the 1943 riots, in which Marines and sailors are beating up on Mexican American kids because they're wearing the zoot suit. You see that happen in 1984. You can draw a straight line, an even firmer, straighter line between the 1984 Olympics and the militarization of the LAPD and the 1992 uprising here in Los Angeles. We're having another Olympics, but now it's not the LAPD that's going to get all the money. They're going to get some of it. But now we have something called the Department of Homeland Security. And they have ICE.
Word.
Right. And you start looking at downtown LA. You start looking at how the police are enforcing these new regulations in regards to street vendors, right? LA is known for its food. It's like, no matter what anyone tells you, like, New York food is cool and all, but it's not the same level of diversity that we have here in LA, right? Like, the fact that 20 years ago you couldn't get a Korean taco is crazy to us now, because all of these Korean restaurants are now selling tacos, because it's a fusion of the different and the diversity that actually does exist here in LA. But that is disappearing as day by day, right? You see those signs. You go to Pasito Olvera and you see the red signs that say, no street vending. You see those expanding outwardly day by day, slowly and slowly, right? Eventually, hopefully, according to the city council and the real estate domination of the city, spreading throughout all of downtown to get rid of all of the dirty street vendors, which is how they see it, right? And the way to enforce that is policing, right? So why is violence such a necessary thing, right? And that's not me saying it. That's actually Martin Luther King saying it, the supposed American champion of nonviolence. He said, violence is the language of the unheard, or riots are the language of the unheard. And he is responding to the 1968 Watts riots, where 2 black men are pulled over because turns out they were driving drunk. But this eventually gets a major altercation between the 2 brothers, their mother, and the police, that eventually blows up into the Watts riots. And that violence was heard because people realized, hey, all of these things that we had promised in the civil rights movement of 1964, 1965, all of that legislation didn't actually accomplish anything. but violence was the only thing that brought some reaction. And in the case of LA, it was a negative reaction because by that point, the LAPD was recruiting people from the South, people who realized like all of these laws that are passed for Black civil rights, as they saw it, were a good way to anger white people. And so what the LAPD does is that they go to the South, they recruit people from the South, and they bring them here because they had a better way of dealing with Black people, according to the LAPD, to William Parker, who is the chief of police at the time. It's William Parker who says that the police are the thin blue line between civilization and barbarism, right? You see that flag, that black flag that, police supporters wear or fly and shit, and they have that blue line. That blue line is referring to what William Parker is talking about in terms of race. It's a very racist symbol on its nature, but because we have this idea that the police are here to protect and serve, Americans don't see it that way. It's like you have to defend the police. You have to hold the police to a standard that even they can't meet because for the most part, they're fucking incompetent, right? Like the LAPD, out of all the police forces in the country, is ridiculously incompetent. Like what they did in Watts, what they did in 1992. One of the lesser known stories is what happened. Have y'all heard of Heidi Fleiss? Has that name? Okay. So Heidi Fleiss was a girl who grew up here in LA, in Los Feliz, and eventually becomes kind of a pimp, like an actual pimp. Like we call women who are pimps madams, right? But she essentially ran a prostitution ring throughout all of LA, where all of the major people in Hollywood, in business, in city government, national government came to her to find young, over 18 women to have sex with, right? And you hear the stories of a lot of these girls, and they'll talk about how we never really had sex with a lot of these men. They just wanted the women around while they did drugs, right? It was just about like the show of like, look how cool I am, I have these women around me. Well, Heidi Fleiss she's still alive. She has a lot of information that she can't talk about anymore because if we ever know everything that she knows, or the story was, she has a little black book. If we know who is in that book, then we would see the whole system crumble. And one of the things that becomes a problem with this story with her is that she had access to the police. The police protected her in many ways because they weren't protecting her. They were protecting the establishment of Los Angeles, right? And so their incompetence almost got all of this information leaked out. But had it not been for the judges overseeing her case that shut it all down, because the police are absolutely incompetent when it comes to protecting people, right? Mm-hmm. We just have to look at the manner in which they treat women and victims of sexual abuse, right? That is a level of incompetence that is unheard of anywhere else in the world.
Or folks with mental illnesses or people who are on the spectrum as well. They don't know how, like the other day, even here in suburban S Ventura, 2 police officers showed up. My neighbor, I think he is on the spectrum. I think he's like high functioning autism, and they did not approach him well. He was like a larger man. He was white, but he's like 6'3" and like screaming and making noises of a toddler, but they just don't know. They don't have that. They aren't trained in those ways to learn how to handle folks with mental illnesses. It's unfortunate.
Like, for the most part, what typically ends up being the standard like training period is about 6 months, because it's about 900 to 1,000 hours, right, of police training, which only comes down to 6 months, which is a problem on its own, because if you want to make the argument that police can get reformed, which is its own argument, right? Like the reformation of the policing system can only come through increased training. But of course, the constant fear that whether it's the media or whether it's the ruling class consistently feeds people is that we need more policing, right? Just today, as we're recording this today, I don't know if you heard about what happened in Brooklyn.
Yeah.
There was a shooting in the subways in Brooklyn, right? Mm-hmm. There were police undercover and non-clothed police officers in those trains, and they